I want to thank my colleague for raising the housing crisis. And yes, certainly people in Elma and Transcona are feeling the squeeze in housing, just as people across the country from coast to coast to coast. The feeling is different depending on where you are. The problems manifest in different ways, but there's no question that people across the country are feeling those pressures. It's why it was a very specific focus for me in the budget speech to talk about the housing crisis. And then recently I was attacked in the National Post, actually, for some of the comments that I made in this place, which I'll take as a badge of honor, considering some of the positions that paper is want to take on a number of issues, let alone housing. But what I found curious about that criticism was that they said I was misrepresenting the housing crisis in order to defend the Liberals, which couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, my point was that the Liberals and the Conservatives have far more in common on housing policy than anybody else. Why? Because they accept that fundamentally housing is a commodity, and that profit should be the ultimate focus of housing policy. And that's been true in this country for over 30 years now, since the Liberals originally cut the National Housing Strategy in 1993. So that was my point. And my point is that we're not going to get past the housing crisis, and we're not going to get to a point where we finally feel that we're making progress on the housing crisis if we don't center housing as a public good in our housing policy, instead of housing as a commodity. And my opinion is that as long as we have Liberals and Conservatives running the country, we're not going to get to that point, because they are ultimately very concerned to protect profit-making in the housing industry and reluctant to accept the idea that housing is a public good or a human right. And while they may want to do that rhetorically, in their policy, they still don't. And that's why a lot of housing policy, even though the Liberals have done more in the housing policy space than any government since 1993, it's not working. I think there's a reason why it's not working. And, what is capitalism? It's a small number of people owning the means of production and everyone else being exploited. What's happening in our housing market is a smaller and smaller group of people owning the housing and everyone else being exploited. So unless we can be critical of capitalism as a model, we're not actually going to fix housing policy in Canada. That was my point, and actually they're birds of a feather when it comes to that. So sorry to the National Post columns that didn't get the point originally. I hope now it's much more clear, and I thank you for the opportunity to make that clarification.